wine in Lucius Malfoy's crystal goblet trembled. He stared at the burgundy liquid, watching the surface ripple in perfect concentric circles, though his hand remained steady against the table's edge. The dining room of Malfoy Manor stretched around him in shadows and candlelight, all silver and deep green, the colors of his heritage and his choices. Narcissa sat across from him, her blonde hair caught in the glow of floating candles, her face a porcelain mask that revealed nothing. Between them, their house elf had laid out pheasant in a reduction sauce that Lucius could not taste. "You've barely touched your plate," Narcissa observed, her voice carrying that particular quality of studied disinterest she had perfected over years of pure-blood social training. But her eyes watched him with an intensity that made something in his chest constrict. Lucius lifted his fork, set it down. The silver clinked against bone china, too loud in the cavernous room. "I find myself without appetite this evening," he said, and was disturbed by how his own voice sounded, distant, as though speaking from the bottom of a well. The fireplace crackled. Beyond the tall windows, November darkness pressed against the glass, complete and absolute. All Hallows' Eve had surrendered to All Saints' Day in those quiet hours when one day becomes another, and Lucius Malfoy felt something that he had not experienced in years. Cold. Not the ordinary cold of autumn nights or winter mornings. This cold originated from within, from a specific point on his left forearm, where, beneath expensive robes and silk shirt, the dark mark had burned for nearly a decade. The mark that had seared into his flesh when he was barely more than a boy, that had pulsed with the Dark Lord's summons, that had connected him to power and purpose and a vision of magical Britain remade. The mark that had, approximately 1 hour ago, gone utterly and completely cold. Lucius reached for his wine again, anything to occupy his hands, to prevent them from traveling to his forearm to touch, to confirm, to verify what he already knew with absolute certainty. The goblet made it halfway to his lips before he noticed his hand was shaking. Narcissa noticed too. She always noticed. Lucius. Not a question. His name, spoken with the weight of shared secrets and careful silences that made up the architecture of their marriage. He met her gaze across the table, across the space that suddenly felt vast as an ocean. In the candlelight, her face held a quality he could not quite name, something between hope and terror, between question and understanding. "Do you feel it?" The words escaped before he could stop them, a crack in the facade he had maintained since the sensation first struck, since he had been standing in his study, reviewing land documents and financial ledgers, the mundane concerns of an ancient pureblood family, when the warmth that had been his constant companion for so long simply vanished. Narcissa's fingers tightened around her own goblet. For a long moment, she did not speak. Then, barely above a whisper, "The house feels different." It did. The manor itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. The portraits on the walls, generations of Malfoys in their gilt frames, had gone unusually quiet. Even the house elves, normally invisible in their efficiency, had become somehow more present in their absence, as though they too sensed the change in the very air. Lucius pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair scraping against marble floor. He needed to move, to pace, to do something other than sit and feel the growing void where warmth and certainty had once resided. His robes swept behind him as he crossed to the window, pressing one palm against the cold glass. Beyond, the manor grounds stretched into darkness, the peacocks silent in their gardens, the elaborate topiaries transformed into grotesque shapes by night. Somewhere in that darkness, the world continued as it always had. Muggles in their villages, oblivious. Other wizarding families in their homes, perhaps feeling what? What were they feeling in this strange, suspended moment? "I should check on Draco," Narcissa said, rising from her chair with the fluid grace that had been trained into her since childhood. But she didn't move toward the door. Instead, she stood beside her chair, one hand resting on its high back, watching him. "He's sleeping," Lucius said. Their son, barely a year old, safely tucked in his nursery under enchantments and house elf watch. Innocent, untouched by the mark, by choices made before his birth, by the cold that now spread through his father's veins. "Yes," Narcissa agreed. "He's sleeping." They stood in silence, the unsaid words heavy between them. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. A portrait somewhere in the house coughed delicately, then fell silent again. Lucius finally gave in to the compulsion that had been building since he sat down to dinner. His right hand moved to his left forearm, pressing through the layers of fabric to the skin beneath. Through the mark that had once burned with such intensity, he had gasped at the summons, had dropped whatever he was doing to answer the call. Nothing. The skin felt like skin, warm from his own body heat, but without that deeper warmth, that connection to something vast and powerful and darkly magnificent. He pressed harder, fingers digging in, searching for any pulse of magic, any hint that this was temporary, an aberration, a test perhaps. Only cold answered. "When did it?" Narcissa started, then stopped. She knew better than to finish questions that might require answers. Neither of them wanted to speak aloud. "An hour ago. Perhaps slightly more." Lucius turned from the window, facing her across the expanse of their dining room, surrounded by the wealth and prestige that had been built over generations. "I was in the study when it simply ceased." Narcissa's face remained carefully neutral, but he saw her swallow. "Have you tried?" "No." Sharp, immediate. He had not tried to contact anyone, had not reached out through the networks that connected the Dark Lord's followers, had not sent his Patronus to Avery or Not, or any of the others who might be experiencing this same hollowing sensation. Because to do so would be to acknowledge what the coldness meant. The house elf appeared then, materializing in the doorway with the peculiar pop of house elf magic. Dobby, the youngest of their servants, barely past his training years. The elf's enormous eyes seemed even larger than usual, catching the candlelight as he wrung his long fingers together. "Master," Dobby squeaked, his voice carrying a tremor that Lucius had never heard before. "Dobby is sorry to interrupt Master and Mistress, but there has been..." The elf seemed unable to complete his thought, frozen in the doorway like a creature caught between instinct and terror. "What is it?" Lucius demanded, his patience already stretched thin, threatening to snap entirely. Dobby flinched, taking a half-step backward. "There is being a message, Master, through the flue. Master Avery is asking to speak with Master most urgently." The dining room seemed to contract around those words. Avery, one of the oldest members, one of the most devoted. If Avery was calling, if Avery was reaching out, then... "Tell him I am indisposed," Lucius said, the words automatic, defensive. "Begging Master's pardon," Dobby whispered, still wringing his hands. But Master Avery is saying it is most urgent. He is saying that Master must be knowing. He is saying... The elf's voice dropped to barely audible. He is saying that everything is being changed. Narcissa's sharp intake of breath was soft, but distinct. Lucius felt his own breath catch in his chest, his lungs suddenly too small, the air too thick. "I'll take it in the study," he said finally, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. He moved toward the door, each step deliberate, controlled. Years of pure blood breeding kept his spine straight, his head high, even as something fundamental crumbled inside him. "Lucius!" Narcissa's voice stopped him at the threshold. When he turned, she had moved closer, her face still that careful mask, but her eyes held a complexity of emotion that he could not untangle. "Whatever has happened, we protect Draco first." He nodded once, sharply. That, at least, required no thought, no deliberation. Whatever else might be uncertain in this strange, cold night that remained absolute. The study seemed darker than he remembered, though he had left it less than 2 hours ago. Lucius waved his wand, and the lamps flickered to life, illuminating walls lined with books and artifacts, some of which would not bear close ministry inspection. His desk sat in its usual place, the ledgers still open where he had abandoned them when the cold first struck. The fireplace glowed green, Avery's face swimming in the flames, distorted and urgent. "Lucius, finally, I've been trying to reach..." Avery's face was pale, his eyes wide with something that looked uncomfortably like panic. "You felt it, haven't you? Tell me you felt it." Lucius moved to stand before the fire, drawing himself up to his full height, channeling every ounce of Malfoy pride and composure. "I don't know what you're referring to. Don't play games. Not now." Avery's voice rose, cracking slightly. "The mark, Lucius. The dark mark. It's gone cold, dead. As if he's..." The man's voice broke off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "Careful what you say through the flu network," Lucius said softly, dangerously. "Auras monitor the flames." Damn the auras! Avery's fear made him reckless. "Don't you understand what this means? If the mark has failed, if the connection is severed, then he must be..." "Enough!" The word cracked like a whip, and Avery's mouth snapped shut. Lucius leaned closer to the flames, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We do not speak of such things. We do not speculate. The Dark Lord's power is beyond our understanding. This could be a test, a trial of our faith." But even as he spoke the words, they tasted like ash in his mouth. A test, a trial. Pretty lies to cover the terrible possibility that clawed at the edges of his mind. McNair felt it too, Avery continued, his voice steadier now, but still edged with desperation. "And Crabbe. I've spoken to both of them. We're not alone in this, Lucius. Something has happened. Something significant." Through the window behind his desk, Lucius could see a sliver of moon emerging from behind clouds. November light, cold and distant. How many times had he stood beneath moon or sun with his fellow Death Eaters, united in purpose, bound by the mark? How many times had he felt the Dark Lord's power flowing through that connection, a constant reminder of the world they were building? "We should meet," Avery said. "Somewhere secure. We need to understand what's happened, coordinate our response." "No." Lucius's voice was firm. "We stay in our homes. We wait. We do nothing that might draw attention." "But nothing, Avery? Do you understand?" If this is indeed what we fear, then the ministry will be watching. The auras will be looking for any excuse to move against us. We have families, estates, reputations to protect. Avery's face in the flames looked haunted. And if he doesn't return, if this is permanent? The question hung in the air like smoke. Lucius felt the cold spread deeper, reaching toward his core. He thought of Narcissa's words, "We protect Draco first." He thought of his son sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware that the world his father had tried to shape for him might be crumbling in the darkness. "Then we adapt," Lucius said, finally, quietly, "as our families have always adapted, as purebloods have survived for centuries." He cut the connection before Avery could respond, waving his hand through the flames until they returned to their natural orange and gold. The study fell silent again, except for the ticking of the ancient clock on the mantel. Lucius sank into his desk chair, suddenly exhausted. His left arm rested on the desk surface, and slowly, deliberately, he rolled up his sleeve. The dark mark stared back at him in the lamplight. The skull and serpent were still visible, still etched into his skin in that distinctive design that had once filled him with pride and purpose. But the black ink seemed faded, the lines less sharp, and when he touched it, pressing his fingers against the mark, he felt nothing but his own skin, his own flesh, empty of the magic that had animated it. Gone, or dying, or... A soft knock on the study door made him jerk upright, hastily pulling his sleeve down. "Enter." Narcissa slipped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. She had changed from her dinner robes into something simpler, her hair now loose around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, more like the girl he had married than the careful society matron she had become. "Is Draco well?" he asked, though he knew she would have told him immediately if anything was amiss. "He's sleeping peacefully. I checked his wards personally." She moved closer, her steps whisper-soft on the carpet. "What did Avery say?" "That others feel it too, that we're not alone in this experience." And Lucius met her eyes. In them, he saw the question she was really asking, the fear she was carefully controlling. "And we don't know what it means." "Not yet." She nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. She reached out and took his left hand in both of hers, her fingers cool and steady. "Whatever comes, Lucius, whatever has happened or will happen, we survive. The Malfoy name survives. Our son survives." He looked down at their joined hands, her pale fingers wrapped around his own. "I gave him my oath," he said quietly, the confession pulled from somewhere deep. "I pledged everything to his cause. The mark is not just ink and magic, Narcissa. It's a bond, a vow sealed in dark magic. If he has truly fallen, then the vow is fulfilled." Her voice was firm, allowing no argument. "You served. You gave your loyalty, your magic, your resources. No one can say you did not honor your commitments. The ministry has no proof of anything specific. You were careful, Lucius. You always have been. We were under the Imperious curse, remember?" The bitter irony in her voice cut sharp. "That will be our story, if a story is needed." He wanted to argue, to explain that it wasn't that simple, that the bonds formed in dark magic didn't simply dissolve with convenience. But looking at his wife, at the determination in her face, at the fierce protection radiating from her, he found he couldn't speak the words. Instead, he squeezed her hands gently. "You should rest. It's late. As should you." but neither of them moved. They stood together in the lamplight study, connected by touch and by the unspoken understanding that sleep would not come easily this night. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, carrying the scent of coming rain. Somewhere in Britain, other Death Eaters were likely having similar conversations, experiencing similar cold realization. Somewhere, the ministry might already be mobilizing, receiving intelligence, preparing responses. Somewhere, the truth of what had happened, what had changed, was spreading like ripples across a dark pond. But here, in Malfoy Manor, Lucius Malfoy sat with his wife's hands in his, feeling the cold spread through his mark, through his arm, through his certainty about the future. The wine from dinner had been left unfinished. The house elves whispered in their quarters below. The portraits held their silence. And in the darkness, in the cold, in the space where warmth and power had once resided, a terrible question took root. What now? The candles burned lower. The night deepened, and the dark mark continued to fade, degree by imperceptible degree, like ink dissolving in water, like certainty surrendering to doubt. The world, Lucius Malfoy realized, would look different in the morning, if he lived to see it. The kitchen of Malfoy Manor existed in perpetual semi-darkness, even at the brightest hours of day, located in the manor's depths, far below the grand rooms where masters dined and entertained. It was a place of stone and shadow, of enormous hearths and copper pots that gleamed dully in the light of enchanted flames. The ceiling pressed low overhead, supported by thick beams that had witnessed centuries of house elf labor. At this hour, past 3 in the morning, when even the portraits drowsed and the peacocks had long since settled in their gilded cages, the kitchen should have been empty. House elves required little sleep, but they understood the rhythm of rest, the necessity of stillness in the deep hours. Tonight, no one rested. Dobby stood at the massive wooden work table, his gnarled fingers knotted together so tightly they had gone pale. Across from him, the manor's senior house elf, Thistle, regarded him with eyes that had seen 70 years of Malfoy service. 2 other elves, younger than Thistle, but older than Dobby, hovered near the hearth, their bat-like ears twitching at every distant sound from the floors above. "Dobby must be still," Thistle hissed, her voice carrying the weight of authority and fear in equal measure. "Master is not calling for us. We is not needed. We must be returning to our quarters." But Dobby's eyes, enormous and luminous in the dim light, remained fixed on something beyond the kitchen walls, beyond the manor itself. He had felt it the moment it happened, that great severing, that sudden absence that had rippled through the magical atmosphere like a stone cast into still water. "The Dark Lord is gone," Dobby whispered, the words barely audible, yet they seemed to echo off the stone walls with the weight of thunder. The other elves froze. Thistle's face contorted with horror and warning, her long fingers rising to cover her mouth as if she could stuff the words back inside Dobby, could unmake their speaking. "Dobby must not say such things." Her voice cracked with terror. "Master will be hearing. Master will be punishing. Dobby is bringing doom to us all." "But Thistle is feeling it too," Dobby insisted, his voice stronger now, trembling with something that might have been hope or might have been terror, or both, intertwined so completely that they became inseparable. "All of us is feeling it. The air is different. The manor is different. The darkness is less." One of the younger elves, Snippy, who tended the manor's extensive gardens, crept forward, her eyes darting toward the kitchen entrance, as if expecting Master Malfoy to materialize at any moment with wand raised and fury blazing. "Dobby speaks dangerous truths," she breathed. "The mark on Master's arm. Snippy saw Master touching it at dinner, saw Master's face when he thought no one was watching." "Silence," Thistle commanded, but her voice lacked conviction. Her ancient eyes held a terrible knowing, a recognition of something she had perhaps been waiting for, dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "We is not speaking of Master's mark. We is not speaking of the Dark Lord. We is being good elves, loyal elves." "Loyal to bad wizards," Dobby said, and the words fell like stones into deep water. The kitchen held its breath. Thistle swayed slightly, as though Dobby had struck her physically. The concept he had voiced, that loyalty itself might be questioned, that the absolute obedience branded into their very magic might be weighed and found wanting, was so fundamentally transgressive that for a moment none of them could speak. Finally, Thistle found her voice, though it emerged thin and strained. "Dobby is too young. Dobby does not understand. We is bound, young one. Bound by magic older and deeper than Dobby knows. We serves the Malfoy family. We does not question. We does not judge." "But we is knowing," Dobby pressed, taking a step closer to the senior elf. "Thistle knows what Master has done, what Master has helped the Dark Lord do. Thistle has cleaned blood from Master's robes, has mended torn fabric, has heard things we is not supposed to hear." Thistle's face crumpled, centuries of careful service warring with something deeper, something that lived beneath the magical bonds that tied house elves to their families. "What Thistle knows changes nothing," she said, but her voice broke on the words. "We is powerless, Dobby. We is property. Our knowing does not matter." "It is mattering now," Dobby said softly, "because the Dark Lord is gone. Dobby feels it, the terrible weight that has been pressing down on all of magical Britain. It is lifted. The darkness is broken." Snippy moved closer to the table, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Dobby is right, if the Dark Lord truly is gone, what is happening to the others, to house elves in other Death Eater homes?" The question opened a door in all their minds. Britain's magical families numbered in the hundreds, and among the Death Eaters' ranks were some of the oldest names, the wealthiest estates. Every Death Eater household had house elves, silent witnesses to their master's comings and goings, to robes hastily cleaned, to orders given in darkness, to the terrible things done in service to the Dark Lord's vision. The Lestrange elves, the fourth elf, Pip, spoke for the first time, his voice high and frightened. "What is they doing tonight? Mistress Bellatrix is the most devoted. If she is feeling what our master feels—" They all knew Bellatrix Lestrange's reputation. The stories travelled through the house elf networks that connected Britain's magical households, whispered tales of cruelty that made even the hardest masters seem gentle by comparison. The Lestrange house elves bore scars both visible and hidden, and their eyes held a haunted quality that made other elves fall silent when they appeared at the rare inter-household gatherings. "They is suffering tonight," Thistle said quietly, all her earlier bluster gone. "Mistress Bellatrix will not be accepting this, will be raging. Her elves will bear the cost of her fury." Dobby's hands clenched into fists at his sides, a gesture so human and so unlike typical house elf submission that the others stared. "It is not right," he said. It has never been right. But now perhaps things can be changing. Dobby dreams dangerous dreams, Thistle warned, but there was less censure in her voice now, more weariness, more, perhaps, understanding. House elves cannot change their circumstances. It is not in our power. The Dark Lord had power, Dobby countered. Everyone said he was the most powerful wizard alive, that no one could be defeating him, that he would be ruling forever. And yet tonight, his mark grows cold. His magic fails. If he can be defeated, then perhaps other things thought impossible is actually possible too. The logic was simple, even childlike, but it struck something deep in each of them. They stood in the kitchen's silence, these creatures bound by magic and tradition, to serve, to obey, to never question, and felt the weight of that binding shift ever so slightly. Miles away, in a considerably less grand dwelling, another conversation was unfolding in darkness. McNair's cottage sat at the edge of the forbidden forest, close enough to Hogwarts that one could see the castle's towers on clear days, distant and accusatory. The cottage itself was small, rough-hewn, suitable for a man whose reputation was built on brutality rather than breeding. Inside, the single main room smelled of blood and steel and the particular musk of magical creatures. Walden McNair sat at his scarred wooden table, a bottle of fire whiskey open before him, though the glass beside it remained empty. His left sleeve was rolled up, exposing the dark mark on his heavily muscled forearm. The executioner's hands, which had ended countless lives, both creature and wizard, trembled as they hovered over the mark. The flue fled green, and Crabbe's florid face appeared in the flames. "Tell me I'm mad," Crabbe said without preamble, his voice thick with something that might have been drink or might have been fear. "Tell me I'm imagining this." McNair's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found words. "You're not mad. Goyle feels it too, and his cousin in Yorkshire. It's spreading, the knowledge, I mean. Everyone who bears the mark knows. We're all feeling it simultaneously." Crabbe's face twisted. "It's him, isn't it? Something's happened to the Dark Lord." "Don't." McNair's voice came out harsh, sharp as the blade of his axe. "Don't speak it aloud, not yet. When, then? When the auras come knocking, when the ministry starts rounding us up." Panic edged into Crabbe's words. "We need to plan, Walden. We need to coordinate. If he's truly gone, he can't be gone." But even as McNair spoke, he felt the lie of it. The mark on his arm, his badge of honor, his proof of service to a cause greater than himself, sat cold and lifeless on his skin. Dead ink, dead magic, dead connection to the power that had defined his adult life. "Lucius is refusing to meet," Crabbe continued, his words coming faster now. "Says we should stay hidden, wait it out. But I'm not like Lucius, Walden. I don't have manor walls and family money to hide behind. If the ministry comes, if they start investigating..." McNair thought of his own service, the things done in the Dark Lord's name. Executions, yes, but also interrogations. Information extracted through means the ministry would call torture. Muggles and muggle-borns and blood traitors who had screamed their secrets in his cottage's cellar before being silenced permanently. "We run," he said finally, the decision crystallizing even as he spoke. "Take what we can carry, disapparate to the continent. We have until dawn, maybe longer. The ministry won't move until they're certain, and they'll need to verify..." "Verify what?" A new voice cut through the flue, sharp and imperious. The flames shifted, and another face appeared beside Crab's, younger, more refined, but wearing the same expression of barely controlled panic. Rookwood, from the Department of Mysteries, the Dark Lord spy within the Ministry itself. "I've been monitoring the department," Rookwood said, without preamble. "The Aura office is stirring. Emergency protocols being activated. They know something, but they're not sure what. I'm hearing rumors from multiple sources. Something happened at Godric's Hollow, the Potter House. There was an attack." McNair felt ice flood his veins. The Potters? The Dark Lord went after the Potters? Their son, the prophecy child. Rookwood's face in the flames looked haggard, older than his years. "But something went wrong. The house is destroyed. There are reports of—" He paused, seemed to struggle with the words. "Reports of celebration, of Death Eater's dark marks failing, of the Dark Lord himself being defeated." The word hung in the air like a curse. Defeated. Not killed, not destroyed. Rookwood was too careful for that, even now. But defeated. Stopped. Removed from power. By a child. Crab's voice rose to near hysteria. "The Dark Lord defeated by an infant? That's impossible. That's—" "Keep your voice down, you fool," McNair snarled. "Your flu is connected to the main network. Anyone could be listening." But Crab wasn't listening anymore. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with the look of a man watching his entire world crumble. "My son, Gregory, he's only 7. If they come for me, if they arrest me, what happens to him? My wife, she's not strong. She couldn't manage alone." "Then you should have thought of that before taking the mark," Rookwood said coldly, the ministry bureaucrats calculating distance, settling over his features. "We all made our choices. Now we face the consequences." "Easy for you to say," McNair growled. "You're insulated. You've got ministry credentials, department protection. Those of us who did the Dark Lord's direct work, who carried out his orders in the field, we're exposed. Which is why you need to disappear." Rookwood's face was implacable. "Tonight, if possible. There are safe houses on the continent, contacts who can provide new identities. I can get you names, locations, but you need to move now." McNair looked around his cottage, at the life he had built in service to a cause he had believed inevitable. His executioner's tools, his trophies from creature kills, the simple furniture that had been enough because he had been part of something greater. All of it suddenly looked small, sordid, the artifacts of a life that had just ended. "And what about you?" he asked Rookwood. "What happens when they start digging through department records, when they find your connection?" Rookwood's smile was thin, bitter. "I'm a survivor, McNair. I always have been. I'll claim I was passing information to the Order, playing both sides. There's no proof otherwise. I made certain of that. Unlike some of you, I understood the importance of plausible deniability." The casual betrayal in those words, the implication that Rookwood had been preparing his exit strategy even while they fought for the Dark Lord's vision, should have enraged McNair, should have made him want to reach through the flue and throttle the younger man. Instead, he felt only exhaustion, bone-deep weariness at the realization that this was what they had become. Not warriors for a cause, not architects of a better magical Britain, but criminals scrambling to escape justice, willing to throw each other to the auras if it meant saving themselves. "The Dark Lord promised us glory," Crab said softly, his earlier panic giving way to a hollowness that was somehow worse. He promised us a world where pure bloods would rule, where our children would inherit a Britain cleansed of Muggle contamination. He promised many things, Rookwood interrupted, and we believed him. But promises from the defeated mean nothing. The ministry will be here soon, gentlemen. I suggest you decide quickly what you value more, your pride or your freedom. The flu connection severed, leaving McNair alone with Crabbe's haunted face in the flames. I can't run, Crabbe said finally. My wife, my son, they're in London. I can't just abandon them. If I flee, the ministry will assume guilt, will come after my family. But if I stay, if I claim imperious, you think they'll believe that? McNair's laugh was harsh. After all we've done, after all the times we followed orders with enthusiasm, with pride, the imperious curse is a coward's defense, Crabbe. Everyone knows it. Then what choice do we have? McNair looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars from years of executioner's work. Large hands, strong hands, hands that had never trembled until tonight. No good ones, he said quietly. Only degrees of bad. Crabbe's face crumpled slightly, then reformed into a mask of desperate determination. I'm staying. I'll take my chances with the ministry. Claim I was forced, that we all were. My son deserves a father, even one who might spend time in Azkaban. Better that than growing up knowing his father was a coward who ran. Noble sentiment, McNair said, though there was no mockery in his voice. I hope it keeps you warm when the Dementors come. And you? McNair was silent for a long moment, considering. The continent beckoned, new identity, new life, freedom from justice, but also exile, forever looking over his shoulder, forever cut off from everything he knew. I haven't decided, he said finally, but Crabbe, whatever happens, whatever choice each of us makes, we were brothers once, in service to something we believed in. That should mean something, even now. Crabbe nodded, his face solemn in the green flames. The Dark Lord is gone, but we remain, for whatever that's worth. The connection severed, leaving McNair alone in his cottage with the dying fire and the cold mark on his arm. Through his window, he could see the first hints of dawn beginning to pale the eastern sky. November 2nd was coming, bringing with it consequences and choices and the end of everything they had built. He poured fire whiskey into his glass at last, raised it in a silent toast to the Dark Lord who had fallen, to the cause that had died, to the brothers in darkness who now scattered like rats from a sinking ship. Then he drank and began to plan for a future he had never imagined he would need to face. In Malfoy Manor's kitchen, Dobby stood alone now. The other elves had finally retreated to their quarters, unable to bear the weight of their own thoughts any longer. But Dobby remained, his large eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the kitchen's small window. Somewhere out there, the world was changing. Somewhere, other house elves were having similar revelations, similar dangerous thoughts. Somewhere, the mechanisms of justice were beginning to turn, grinding slowly but inevitably toward those who had served darkness. And in the manor above, Master Malfoy sat in his study, feeling his mark grow colder by the hour, understanding that when dawn came, everything would be different. Dobby pressed one gnarled hand against his chest, feeling the flutter of his own heartbeat, the warmth of his own breath. He was still bound, still enslaved, still property of the Malfoy family. But the Dark Lord was gone. And if the impossible could happen once, then perhaps it could happen again. The thought was dangerous, revolutionary, impossible. But in the deep darkness before dawn, Dobby allowed himself to hold it close, a small spark of something that might have been hope, warming him against the cold November night. The Ministry of Magic never truly slept, but it had rhythms. Hours when the fireplaces quieted, when the memo flights slowed to occasional flutters, when even the most dedicated bureaucrats surrendered to exhaustion and went home. The early hours of November 1st should have been among the quietest, that dead time between midnight and dawn when only security patrols and emergency personnel remained. Instead, the atrium blazed with light. Bartemius Crouch Sr. stood before the fountain of magical brethren, his austere face reflected in the water that cascaded from the wands of the golden statues. His robes were impeccable despite the hour, 3:47 in the morning by his pocket watch, and his posture remained rigid with the discipline that had carried him through 2 decades of ministry service. But his hands, clasped behind his back, trembled slightly. Around him, the atrium had transformed into controlled chaos. Auras moved with purpose through the space, some arriving via flue in bursts of green flame, others apparating directly to the designated points with sharp cracks that echoed off the peacock blue ceiling. Memoranda flew in thick clouds overhead, their wings beating frantically as they sought their recipients. The usual golden glow of the enchanted ceiling had been replaced with harsh white light, emergency illumination that turned everything stark and shadowless. "Sir." Rufus Scrimgeour materialized at Crouch's elbow, his leonine mane of tawny hair disheveled, his scarred face grave. The head aura carried an air of barely contained intensity, like a hound straining at its leash. "We've confirmed it. Multiple sources. The reports from Godric's Hollow, they're accurate." Crouch turned slowly, his movements deliberate. "Explain. Accurately. No speculation." Scrimgeour pulled a roll of parchment from his robes, but he didn't need to consult it. At approximately 2300 hours on October 31st, there was a massive discharge of dark magic at the Potter residence in Godric's Hollow. Muggle authorities in the area reported what they described as an explosion. "Our advance team arrived 40 minutes ago and found—" He paused, seemed to choose his words carefully. "The house is destroyed, sir. Completely. The magical signature is unlike anything our curse breakers have seen. It appears to be a rebound effect of some kind. And the Potters—" Crouch's voice remained level, but something flickered behind his eyes. "James Potter is dead. Lily Potter is dead." Scrimgeour's jaw tightened. "Their son, Harry, survived. He's with Hagrid currently, on Dumbledore's orders, being taken to relatives for protection." The news should have landed like a thunderclap, but in the strange suspended reality of this night, it felt almost inevitable. Crouch nodded once, sharply. "And the Dark Lord?" Scrimgeour's expression shifted, uncertainty warring with something that might have been hope but seemed too fragile to name. "No body has been recovered. But, sir, there are reports coming in from across Britain. Death Eaters. Their dark marks." He touched his own forearm unconsciously, though he bore no such mark. "They're failing, going cold. We've intercepted flu conversations. Monitoring charms are picking up panic among known Death Eater associates. They believe he's gone." Believing and knowing are different things, Rufus. But even as Crouch spoke, he felt the shift in the air, the way the ministry itself seemed to be holding its breath. "We need confirmation. Send teams to every known Death Eater residence. I want surveillance established within the hour. And get me Dumbledore. I don't care if he's at Hogwarts or the moon. I need to speak with him immediately. Already sent word, sir. He's not responding through standard channels. Of course he wasn't. Dumbledore operated by his own rules, his own timeline. Crouch felt frustration flare hot in his chest, but he forced it down. There were larger concerns now, strategic considerations that went far beyond one wizard's obstinacy, however powerful. The Wizengamot, Crouch asked. Minister Bagnold is being notified as we speak. She's calling an emergency session for dawn. Scrimgeour hesitated. Sir, there's already talk. If the Dark Lord truly is defeated, if this is the end of the war, people will want justice, trials. The Aura office has been compiling evidence for years, but we've never had the opportunity to move. Now we must be careful. Crouch's voice sharpened. The Death Eaters are dangerous precisely because they're cornered. Wounded animals are the most vicious. We move methodically, strategically. No witch hunts, no mob justice. Everything by the book, through proper channels, with proper evidence. Even as he said it, Crouch felt the weight of his own history pressing down. His son, Barty Jr., was sleeping safely at Crouch Manor under house arrest, an imperious curse, kept from Azkaban by his dying mother's final wish. The irony of standing here, preparing to prosecute other Death Eaters, while his own son. He severed that thought before it could complete. Personal matters had no place in this moment. The Ministry needed him focused, needed his legendary discipline and prosecutorial skill to navigate the treacherous waters ahead. An Aura, young, female, with the bright-eyed intensity of recent academy graduation, rushed up to Scrimgeour. Sir, reports coming in from Diagon Alley. People are gathering. Someone started celebrating in the leaky cauldron. It's spreading. Scrimgeour cursed under his breath. It's too soon. We haven't confirmed. The word is out, Crouch interrupted. The moment multiple Death Eaters felt their marks fail, the moment our teams moved to Godric's Hollow, the news began spreading. You can't contain information like this, Rufus. It's like trying to hold back the tide. Through the atrium's tall windows, Crouch could see the London night beginning to pale toward dawn. How many people were awake now, passing whispered news from fireplace to fireplace, from friend to friend? How many families who had lost loved ones to Death Eater attacks were hearing the rumors and daring to hope? How many were weeping with relief or disbelief, or the complicated grief of victory that came too late to save those already lost? Send patrols to Diagon Alley, Crouch ordered. Keep the celebration contained, but don't try to stop it. People need to process this, need to believe it's real, but make sure it doesn't turn into a riot. The last thing we need is vigilante justice against suspected Death Eaters. What about the known Death Eaters themselves? Scrimgeour asked. Do we move to arrest? Crouch was silent for a moment, considering. This was the moment he had been preparing for, in some sense, for years. The war had dragged on for over a decade. Terror and counter-terror, lives lost and families destroyed. The Death Eaters had operated with near impunity, protected by wealth and influence and fear. But if the Dark Lord truly was gone, if his protection was removed, begin with surveillance only, he said finally. Watch them. Document everything. If any attempt to flee, apprehend them. But no mass arrests, not yet. We need airtight cases, Rufus. These aren't common criminals. They're wealthy, connected. They have the best solicitors in Britain. If we move too quickly, if we make mistakes, they'll slip through our fingers using legal technicalities. Scrimgeour looked frustrated, but nodded. And the ones who are under Imperius? How do we handle those claims? The question hung heavy in the air. The Imperius cursed defense. Coercion through dark magic, removing agency and responsibility. Some would claim it legitimately. Others would use it as a convenient lie. Sorting truth from fiction would be nearly impossible. We investigate each case individually, Crouch said. Veritaserum interrogations, memory examinations, witness testimony. It will take time, but it must be done properly. He turned to face Scrimgeour fully. The wizarding world has been living in fear for over a decade, Rufus. They need to see that justice is possible, that the rule of law means something. But they also need to see that we're not the same as the Death Eaters, that we don't operate through fear and summary punishment. Even for people like Bellatrix Lestrange, like Dolohov. Scrimgeour's voice carried an edge. These people have killed, tortured, destroyed. They deserve Azkaban. And they'll get it if the evidence supports it. But through proper trials, not through revenge. Crouch's voice softened slightly. I understand your frustration. I share it. But the moment we abandon proper procedure is the moment we become what we're fighting against. A commotion near the fireplaces drew their attention. More auras were arriving, and with them came others. Members of the Wizengamot pulled from their beds, department heads summoned to crisis, even a few reporters from the Daily Prophet who had somehow gotten wind of the emergency and were being firmly escorted out by security. This is going to be a circus, Scrimgeour muttered. Yes, Crouch agreed. Which is why we need to control the narrative from the start. Get me a secure conference room. I want every department head briefed within the hour. And find Dumbledore. I don't care what it takes. As Scrimgeour moved off to execute the orders, Crouch allowed himself a moment of stillness in the chaos. He thought of the Potters, young, talented, murdered in their home while trying to protect their son. He thought of the countless others lost to this war, the names that had accumulated over years until they formed a litany of grief. He thought of his own son, of choices made and consequences that would never fully resolve. And he thought of what dawn would bring. Not just the light of a new day, but the beginning of a transformation. The wizarding world would wake to news that seemed impossible, that the Dark Lord who had terrorized them for over a decade was gone, defeated by a child barely old enough to speak. They would want answers. They would want justice. They would want reassurance that this was truly the end, not just another lull before the terror resumed. Crouch squared his shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him like a familiar cloak. He had spent his career building a reputation for strictness, for unwavering adherence to law and order. Some called him harsh, even cruel in his prosecutorial zeal. But this moment, this was what he had been preparing for. Sir, another aura approached, this one older, bearing the scars of someone who had seen active combat. We've got movement. McNair's cottage. Our surveillance team reports he's packing. Looks like he might be preparing to run. Crouch's mind shifted immediately into tactical mode. How many teams do we have in position around known Death Eater locations? 17 so far, with more deploying. We're spread thin, but we're covering the priority targets. If McNair runs, let him go initially, but track him. I want to know where he goes, who he contacts. He might lead us to others." Crouch paused, considering. "Actually, no. Detain him if he attempts to leave Britain. We can't risk losing suspects to the continent, but make it clean. No public confrontations, no unnecessary force." The aura saluted and hurried off. Crouch watched him go, then turned his attention back to the atrium. It was filling rapidly now, the early morning shift arriving to find their workplace transformed into a war room. He could see the questions in their faces, the mixture of hope and uncertainty. A witch from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes approached, her face pale. "Mr. Crouch, sir. We're receiving reports of accidental magic surges across Britain. It seems the emotional response to the news is causing magical instability, particularly among younger witches and wizards. We've had 3 incidents of uncontrolled levitation, 2 cases of spontaneous combustion of household items, and 1 wizard who apparently turned his entire house blue." Despite everything, Crouch felt a flicker of something that might have been amusement. Deploy containment teams to assist. Priority to any incidents that might expose the wizarding world to muggles. Everything else can wait. "Yes, sir." She hurried away, already conjuring memoranda to dispatch orders. The organized chaos continued to build around him. Crouch let it wash over him, his mind already working through contingencies and strategies. There would be trials, many trials. The Death Eaters, who could be proven guilty, would face justice. But there would also be complications, legal challenges, political maneuvering. Families like the Malfoys had wealth and influence that could buy delays, could create reasonable doubt, could twist the law to their advantage. It would be his job to ensure that didn't happen, to build cases so airtight that no amount of money or influence could overcome them, to show the wizarding world that justice was possible, that the rule of law could prevail even against the darkest magic. "Mr. Crouch," Scrimgeour was back, slightly breathless. "We've got him. Dumbledore's arrived at the Ministry. He's asking to speak with you privately." Finally, Crouch felt tension. He hadn't realized he was carrying ease slightly. "Where?" "Level 2. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement conference room. I've cleared it and placed privacy wards." Crouch nodded and began moving toward the lifts, his robes billowing behind him. Around him, the Ministry continued its frantic activity, a hive disturbed, reorganizing itself to face a new reality. He stepped into a lift, and as the golden grills closed and it began to descend, he allowed himself one moment of acknowledgement. The Dark Lord was gone. After over a decade of terror, of living in fear, of watching Britain descend into chaos and violence, the architect of it all had been defeated by a child, an infant who survived what should have been unsurvivable. It was impossible. It was miraculous. It was... The lift doors opened onto level 2, interrupting his thoughts. Crouch stepped out into the corridor, finding Scrimgeour waiting outside the conference room. "He's inside. Wouldn't tell me anything. Said he needed to speak with you directly." Scrimgeour's frustration was evident. "Sir, whatever he tells you, we need to know. The auras have been in the dark for too long about Dumbledore's operations." "I understand, Rufus, but right now, information is more important than protocol." Crouch placed a hand briefly on the younger man's shoulder. "Trust me to handle this. He pushed open the conference room door. Albus Dumbledore stood by the window, his back to the door, his tall frame silhouetted against the grey pre-dawn light filtering through. His robes were simpler than usual, no stars or moons, just deep blue wool, and his long silver beard seemed dimmer somehow, as though grief had leached the luster from it. "Barty," Dumbledore said without turning, "thank you for seeing me at this unusual hour." "Unusual doesn't begin to describe this night, Albus." Crouch closed the door behind him, hearing the privacy wards activate with a soft hum. "I need information. Real information, not more of your enigmatic hints and strategic omissions." Dumbledore turned slowly, and Crouch was struck by how old he looked. The headmaster of Hogwarts, the defeater of Grindelwald, the most powerful wizard in Britain. In this moment, he looked ancient and weary, carrying a weight that bent even his considerable strength. "James and Lily Potter are dead," Dumbledore said quietly, "murdered by Voldemort in their attempt to protect their son. They died as heroes, Barty. They died choosing love over survival. And Voldemort, gone, destroyed, I believe, though not in any conventional sense." Dumbledore moved to the conference table, lowering himself into a chair with uncharacteristic heaviness. The magic Lily Potter invoked when she died to save her son created a protection I have only read about in ancient texts. When Voldemort attempted to kill Harry, that protection rebounded his curse. The result? He gestured vaguely. "You've seen the house, I presume? Or what remains of it?" Crouch sat across from him, leaning forward. "The boy survived. Harry survived. He bears a scar, lightning-shaped on his forehead, but otherwise he is unharmed, physically at least." Dumbledore's blue eyes, usually twinkling with hidden knowledge, were dark with sorrow. "I have placed him with his mother's sister, Petunia Dursley, and her family. The blood protection Lily created will be strongest there, among blood, relatives, and the Death Eaters will fracture. Some will claim they were forced, coerced, others will go into hiding. A few," Dumbledore paused, "a few may truly have been under the Imperious curse, Barty. You must be thorough in your investigations. Justice must be served, but it must be true justice." Crouch felt irritation flare. "Don't lecture me about justice, Albus. I've spent my career. I know what you've spent your career doing. I also know about your son." The words fell like stones into still water. Crouch went rigid, his hands clenching on the table edge. "That is not relevant to—" "It is entirely relevant." Dumbledore's voice was gentle but firm. "You will be leading the prosecutions, Barty. You will be determining who deserves Azkaban and who deserves leniency. Your judgment must be unclouded by personal bias, whether that bias comes from mercy toward your own family or harshness to prove you're not showing favoritism." Crouch stood abruptly, turning away from the table. "I have never let personal considerations interfere with my duties." "Haven't you?" Dumbledore's question was soft but penetrating. "Your reputation for strictness, your unwavering prosecution of dark wizards, some would say it's compensation, Barty. Proof that you're not soft on dark magic despite your son's choices. My son is under control. He will never harm anyone again." "Under Imperious curse control, you mean? The very defense you'll be interrogating when Death Eaters claim it." Dumbledore sighed. "I'm not your judge, Barty. I'm simply asking you to examine your own motivations as you move forward. The wizarding world needs justice, but it also needs healing. Be careful that your pursuit of one doesn't prevent the other. Crouch remained facing away, his jaw tight. After a long moment, he spoke quietly. "What do you need from me, Albus? You didn't come here just to question my character. I need you to understand that this is not a simple victory. Voldemort is gone, yes, but the ideology that spawned him, the prejudices and fears he exploited, those remain. How you handle the Death Eater trials will set the tone for how Britain heals or fails to heal from this war." Dumbledore stood, moving toward the door. "Be just, Barty, but also be wise. The two are not always the same thing." He left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Crouch alone in the conference room as dawn began to break outside the windows. In the distance, through the walls and floors of the ministry, Crouch could hear the growing sounds of activity. Britain was waking to a new world. The war was over. Justice was coming. And Barty Crouch Sr., standing alone in the grey morning light, felt the full weight of what that would require settle onto his shoulders, like a sentence he would carry until the day he died. The village of Godric's Hollow had always carried an air of timelessness, as though the centuries passed over it more gently than elsewhere in Britain. Its cobbled streets wound between cottages that had stood for generations, their thatched roofs and climbing roses speaking of continuity and peace. The small square with its war memorial transformed into a nativity at Christmas. The churchyard where wizards and muggles rested side by side beneath ancient yews. It was a place where magic and ordinary life had coexisted for so long that the boundary between them had worn thin and permeable. On the morning of November 1st, that peace lay shattered. Minerva McGonagall stood at the end of the street, her tartan travelling cloak pulled tight against the November cold, and stared at the ruin that had been the Potter house. Even from this distance, she had stopped a respectful 50 yards away. The devastation was absolute. The cottage that had stood there, pretty and ivy-covered and full of young life, had been reduced to rubble. Walls stood at odd angles, their stones blackened and cracked. The roof had collapsed entirely, timber beams jutting toward the sky like broken bones. Through the gaps, she could see the remnants of the interior, furniture splintered, belongings scattered, the intimate debris of a life violently ended. The cottage sat behind a hedge that had somehow survived the blast, though its leaves had been scorched brown. Muggle neighbours on either side remained mercifully intact, their windows dark at this early hour, though McGonagall could see curtains twitching. They would have heard the explosion, would have seen the lights, would be creating whatever explanations Muggles used to rationalize the inexplicable. She should move closer, should examine the scene properly, should fulfill the duty Dumbledore had assigned her. But her feet seemed rooted to the cobblestones, her body refusing to carry her toward the evidence of such complete destruction. James and Lily Potter were dead. She had known intellectually from the moment Dumbledore's Patronus had found her in her quarters at Hogwarts, had understood the words, had grasped their meaning. But standing here, seeing the physical proof of violence, the reality was beginning to penetrate the shock that had insulated her through the night. She had taught them both, had watched James mature from an arrogant boy into a brave man, had seen Lily's brilliance and kindness shine through every lesson, had attended their wedding just 3 years ago. Merlin, had it only been 3 years, had held baby Harry at the christening, felt his tiny fingers close around her own, seen the joy in Lily's eyes as she cradled her son. All of it ended in one terrible night. "Professor," the voice made McGonagall turn sharply, wand half drawn before she registered the speaker. Hagrid stood behind her, his massive frame blocking out the early morning light, his face blotchy and swollen with tears. In his enormous arms, wrapped in what appeared to be Hagrid's own moleskin coat, a small bundle stirred. "Hagrid!" McGonagall's voice came out rough. She cleared her throat, attempting to restore some semblance of composure. "You have him? You have Harry?" "Pulled him from the rubble myself, Professor." Hagrid's voice broke on the words. He was crying, but not hurt. Not really hurt, I mean, just this. He shifted the bundle carefully, revealing a small face, this mark on his forehead. McGonagall stepped closer, her heart constricting. Harry Potter gazed up at her with his mother's green eyes, Lily's eyes, so startlingly bright against his pale skin. And there, bisecting his forehead beneath a tuft of black hair, was a wound unlike any she had seen. Lightning-shaped, raw and red, it looked almost like a rune carved into flesh. "What happened to him?" she whispered, reaching out to touch the mark with one gentle finger. Harry gurgled at her touch, one small hand emerging from the coat to wave vaguely in the air. "Don't know, Professor. But—" Hagrid's voice dropped lower, though there was no one near enough to hear. "But you know who's gone, innit? Dumbledore said so. Said whatever Lily did to protect little Harry, it destroyed you-know-who. Sent him away, or killed him, or—" He couldn't seem to finish the thought, his face crumpling again. "James and Lily are gone, Professor. They're really gone." McGonagall felt her own eyes begin to burn, but she forced the tears back through sheer will. There would be time for grief later. Now there were practicalities to attend to, duties to fulfill. "We should go," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Dumbledore wants Harry taken to his aunt's house before the village fully wakes, before the reporters arrive." "The reporters?" Hagrid looked alarmed. "But how would they? The Ministry knows by now, which means the Daily Prophet knows, which means half of magical Britain will know by breakfast." McGonagall glanced back at the ruined cottage. "This will be front-page news for weeks. The boy who lived, the defeat of you-know-who. Everyone will want to see him, to touch him, to claim some connection to the victory." "He's not a trophy," Hagrid said fiercely, pulling Harry closer. "He's just a baby who's lost his mum and dad." "I know." McGonagall's voice softened. "Which is why we need to get him to safety, to family, before the circus begins." But neither of them moved. They stood together on the quiet street, the giant man and the stern professor, looking at the ruins of the house where their friends had died, holding the child who had somehow survived the unsurvivable. "Should we—" Hagrid gestured toward the rubble. "Should we go closer, pay our respects proper-like?" McGonagall hesitated, then nodded. Together they walked toward the cottage, their footsteps loud in the morning stillness. As they drew nearer, details became clearer. The front door hung at an angle, blasted off its hinges. Through the windows, those that remained, she could see into what had been the sitting room. A sofa overturned, books scattered across the floor, their pages fluttering in the breeze that entered through 1,000 cracks. A photograph in a broken frame, the faces still moving, though the glass was shattered. She stopped at what had been the garden gate, now hanging twisted from one hinge. The wardstones that had protected the house lay scattered, their protective magic spent or broken. Someone, Dumbledore, presumably, had already removed the bodies. The house stood empty now, a monument to violence and loss. "I can't believe it," McGonagall said quietly, more to herself than to Hagrid. All the protections, the Fidelius charm. James was so talented with defensive magic, and Lily's charms work was some of the finest I've ever seen from a student. How did he get through? Dumbledore said someone betrayed him. Hagrid's voice was thick with anger and grief. Their secret keeper sold him out to you-know-who. The words landed like physical blows. McGonagall felt her hands clench into fists, her magic sparking at her fingertips with the force of her rage. Who? Sirius Black. The name hung in the air between them. Sirius Black. James's best friend, Harry's godfather, the man they had trusted above all others to keep the secret of their location safe. The betrayal was so absolute, so incomprehensible, that McGonagall couldn't quite process it. "That's not possible," she said. But even as she spoke, she knew it was. Hadn't she seen enough betrayals during the war? Enough friends turning on friends? Enough families torn apart by ideology and fear? James trusted him completely. They were like brothers. Brothers can betray each other too, Professor. Hagrid shifted Harry carefully, the baby now sleeping peacefully against his chest, oblivious to the conversation about the man who had condemned his parents. Dumbledore said, "Black's gone into hiding. Auras are searching for him." McGonagall stared at the ruined house, trying to reconcile the laughing boy she remembered, arrogant but loyal, mischievous but brave, with the monster who could sell his best friend to death. "I hope they find him," she said quietly, her voice carrying a hardness that would have surprised her students. "I hope they find him and give him exactly what he deserves." A sound from the cottage made them both freeze, a soft creak of settling timber, or perhaps footsteps in the rubble. McGonagall's wand was out instantly, pointed toward the darkness beyond the broken door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice sharp with authority and readiness. "Show yourself." For a moment, nothing. Then a figure emerged from the shadows of the doorway, picking its way carefully over broken stones and splintered wood. Not a threat. McGonagall recognized him immediately from his white blonde hair, though he was rarely seen this far from the Ministry. "Dawlish," she said, lowering her wand slightly but not entirely. "What are you doing here?" John Dawlish, a young Auror who had graduated from Hogwarts just a few years prior, looked pale and shaken. "Professor McGonagall, Mr. Hagrid." He nodded to each of them, his eyes lingering on the bundle in Hagrid's arms. "I've been sent to secure the scene. The Ministry needs to document everything before." He gestured vaguely at the village around them. "Before it becomes a tourist attraction." "A tourist attraction," McGonagall repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "2 people are dead, Dawlish. This is a crime scene, not a carnival." "I know, Professor, I know." Dawlish ran a hand through his hair, looking younger than his years. "But you know how people will react. The Dark Lord defeated. Everyone's going to want to see where it happened, to say they were here. The Ministry wants to preserve what evidence exists before it's contaminated." McGonagall wanted to argue, to rage against the callousness of treating this tragedy as a bureaucratic problem to be managed. But she knew he was right. By afternoon, Godric's Hollow would be overrun with witches and wizards come to gawk and speculate and celebrate. The intimate horror of what had happened here would be transformed into public spectacle. "Have you found anything?" she asked instead, her voice carefully neutral. "Any evidence of how he broke through the Fidelius?" Dawlish shook his head. "The magical signatures are complex. Curse breakers are being brought in from Gringotts to analyze them properly. But there's something in the nursery." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Something the senior Aurors want Dumbledore to examine personally. Dark magic, but not quite like anything we've catalogued before. The nursery, where Lily had died protecting her son, where Voldemort's curse had rebounded, destroying him instead of the infant he'd come to murder." McGonagall felt her throat tighten again. "We need to leave," she said abruptly. "Take Harry to his relatives, as Dumbledore instructed. This place—" She looked around at the devastation, at the home that would never again hold laughter or love. "This is no place for a child." "Wait." Dawlish stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Before you go, Professor, there's something else you should know. Word has already spread through the village. Muggle police were here earlier, asking questions about the explosion. We've had to modify several memories already, and more obliviators are on the way. But there's talk among the Muggles about seeing someone on a flying motorcycle last night." Hagrid stiffened. "That was me. Dumbledore asked me to fetch Harry, to bring him out safe." "I know, but the Muggles—" Dawlish sighed. "They're going to be a problem. This wasn't a subtle attack. The entire street felt it. We're working on a cover story. Gas explosion, most likely. But it's going to take time to ensure the statute of secrecy remains intact." "Then I suggest you get to work," McGonagall said crisply. "Mr. Hagrid and I have orders to follow. Unless you're planning to detain us?" "No, Professor." "Of course not." Dawlish stepped aside, gesturing toward the street. "Just be careful. There are already reports of celebrations breaking out in magical communities across Britain. People are flooding into Diagon Alley, drinking and singing. Some are looking for Death Eaters to exact revenge. It's chaos out there." McGonagall nodded curtly and turned away from the cottage, Hagrid falling into step beside her. They walked in silence back toward the street corner where Hagrid had left Sirius Black's flying motorcycle. Another betrayal, the use of a traitor's property, though McGonagall supposed it didn't matter now. "Professor." Hagrid's voice was small, uncertain in a way that was deeply unsettling from such a large man. "What's going to happen to him? To Harry?" McGonagall looked at the sleeping child, so peaceful in Hagrid's arms, unaware of the weight of expectation and tragedy that would follow him for the rest of his life. "He'll grow up with his mother's family, away from all this madness, from the fame and attention. Dumbledore thinks it's safest. The blood protection will be strongest there. But they're Muggles, ain't they? They won't understand." "No, they won't." McGonagall's voice was heavy with resignation. "Petunia Dursley is Lily's sister, but they were estranged. I've been watching the family, Hagrid. They're not the sort of people I would choose to raise a magical child. But Dumbledore insists, and the blood magic is powerful protection against any remaining Death Eaters who might seek revenge. It doesn't seem right," Hagrid muttered. "Taking him away from everyone who knew his parents, who could tell him about them proper-like. Nothing about this is right, Hagrid. Nothing about war is ever right." McGonagall reached out to touch Harry's cheek one more time, feeling the warmth of living skin. the proof that at least one life had been saved from the darkness. But we do what we must to keep him safe. That's what James and Lily would have wanted. They reached the motorcycle, its chrome gleaming in the strengthening daylight. Somewhere in the village, a rooster crowed. Lights were beginning to appear in windows as Godric's Hollow woke to what would be the most extraordinary day in its long history. Hagrid settled himself onto the motorcycle, still cradling Harry carefully against his chest. "You coming with us, Professor?" McGonagall shook her head. "I need to return to Hogwarts. The students will be waking soon, and they'll need to be told. Carefully, gently." She paused, thinking of all those young faces. Some who had lost family to Death Eaters, some whose families served the Dark Lord. This news will affect them differently, and I need to be there to help them understand. Right. Hagrid kicked the motorcycle to life, its engine roaring loud enough to wake the entire street. "Take care of yourself, Professor. And you, Hagrid, keep him safe." She watched as the motorcycle lifted into the air, rising above the rooftops of Godric's Hollow, banking toward the south, where little Whinging and the Dursley family waited in ignorance. Harry's small form was just visible, bundled in Hagrid's coat, the lightning scar hidden beneath dark hair. The boy who lived, the child who had defeated Lord Voldemort, the orphan who would grow up not knowing what he had lost, what he had survived, what burdens would be placed upon him by a wizarding world desperate for a hero. McGonagall stood alone on the street as dawn fully broke over Godric's Hollow, gilding the ruins of the Potter house in golden light that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. Behind her, she could hear Dawlish calling to other Aurors, organizing the preservation of the scene. Around her, curtains were being pulled back, doors opening as curious muggles emerged to investigate the previous night's disturbance. She needed to leave, needed to return to Hogwarts, to her duties, to the hundreds of students who would need guidance through this unprecedented day. But for one more moment, she allowed herself to stand and grieve, to mourn two students she had taught and cared for, two young people who should have had decades ahead of them, who should have watched their son grow and learn and discover his magic. "Goodbye, Lily," she whispered to the ruined house, to the empty air, to the ghosts that would surely linger here. "Goodbye, James. Rest well, knowing your son lives, that love proved stronger than darkness, that you did not die in vain." The wind carried her words away, scattering them over Godric's Hollow like seeds that might, someday, grow into understanding. McGonagall drew her wand, cast one last look at the cottage, and disapparated with a soft crack that echoed off the cobblestones. The village fell quiet again, save for the gathering muggles and the Aurors going about their grim work. The cottage stood in ruins, a monument to sacrifice and survival, and somewhere to the south, a baby slept on, unaware that he had already changed the world simply by continuing to draw breath. November 1st had arrived. The war was over. The darkness had lifted. But the cost, the terrible, irrevocable cost, lay scattered in rubble and memory across a small village that would never be quite the same again. The ancient clock in the Lestrange drawing room had stopped at precisely 11 minutes past 11 on the previous night. Bellatrix Lestrange stared at its frozen hands, her dark eyes bloodshot and wild, her usually immaculate appearance dishevelled in a way that would have been unthinkable mere hours ago. Her robes hung askew, Her hair had escaped its elaborate styling to hang in tangles around her face, and her left sleeve was rolled up to expose the dark mark that she had been touching obsessively since the coldness had struck. The mark that now looked like nothing more than faded ink on pale skin. "He's not gone," she said, for perhaps the 100th time, her voice hoarse from hours of denial and rage. He promised immortality, promised power beyond death. He cannot be gone." Across the room, her husband Rodolphus sat slumped in an armchair, a bottle of fire whiskey dangling from one hand. His own mark was similarly faded, and unlike his wife, he seemed to have passed through denial into a kind of numb acceptance that was somehow more disturbing than Bellatrix's mania. "The marks don't lie, Bella," he said quietly, his words slightly slurred. "We all feel it. The connection is severed." "Then it's a test." Bellatrix whirled on him, her wand suddenly in her hand, though she seemed unaware of having drawn it. "A trial of our loyalty, our faith. The Dark Lord is testing us, seeing who remains true when the path grows difficult." "For Merlin's sake, woman," Rodolphus began, but he was cut off by the appearance of their house elf, an ancient creature named Creaky, who had served the Lestrange family for 3 generations. The elf materialized with a soft pop, its enormous eyes fixed on the floor, its skeletal frame trembling. "Masters," it wheezed, in a voice like rusted hinges. "There is being visitors at the gate. 3 wizards, masters. They is wearing the robes of..." The elf's voice dropped to barely audible. "Of auras, masters." The words seemed to freeze the air in the drawing room. Bellatrix's face went through a rapid series of transformations, shock, rage, calculation, and finally a terrible smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Auras," she repeated, her voice suddenly silky, dangerous. "How predictable. They think because the Dark Lord has momentarily withdrawn, they can move against his faithful servants." "Bella!" Rodolphus struggled to his feet, the fire whiskey bottle falling to the carpet with a dull thud. "We need to think. If they have evidence, if they've come to arrest, let them try." Bellatrix's wand remained steady in her hand, and her eyes had taken on a feverish gleam. "I am Bellatrix Lestrange, of the noble and most ancient house of Black. I have served the greatest wizard who ever lived with unwavering devotion. These ministry lapdogs think they can intimidate me?" A thunderous knock echoed through the manor, the sound of fists on the heavy oak front door amplified by magic to ensure it could not be ignored. Creaky flinched violently, pressing itself against the wall. "Shall Creaky be answering, masters?" the elf whispered. "Yes," Rodolphus said. At the same moment, Bellatrix said, "No." They stared at each other across the drawing room, husband and wife, bound by marriage and ideology, but suddenly finding themselves on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. Rodolphus wanted survival, accommodation, perhaps even surrender. Bellatrix wanted defiance, wanted to spit in the face of the ministry even if it cost her everything. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. A voice called through the door, amplified by a sonorous charm. "This is the Aura Office of the Ministry of Magic. Open the door immediately, or we will enter by force." "We're not ready for this," Rodolphus said urgently, moving toward his wife. "Bella, please, think of Andromeda. Think of..." "Don't you dare speak that blood traitor's name in this house." Bellatrix's voice rose to a shriek. "I have no sister who married a mudblood. and disgraced our family name. Then think of yourself. Think of me. Rodolphus grabbed her shoulders, shaking her slightly. If we're arrested, if we're sent to Azkaban, we can't serve the Dark Lord when he returns. We need to be strategic, Bella. Claim Imperius. Say we were forced. Survive this so we can fight another day. For a moment, something flickered in Bellatrix's eyes. Reason, perhaps, or calculation. But then it was gone, drowned by the fanaticism that had defined her adult life. I will not dishonor my service with lies and cowardice. I served the Dark Lord freely, proudly. I would do it again without hesitation. Then you're a fool. Rodolphus released her, stepping back with something like defeat in his face. And I won't go to Azkaban with you. Before Bellatrix could respond, the front door exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Curses flew through the entrance hall, stunning spells, binding hexes, magical lights that revealed every shadow. Heavy footsteps echoed on marble floors as auras poured into the Lestrange manor. Bellatrix's wand came up, her face transformed by a terrible joy. Finally, she breathed. Finally, a worthy fight. Bella, no. Rodolphus lunged for her, but she was already moving, already casting. Thousands of miles away, in a small cottage on the windswept coast of Scotland, Antonin Dolohov stood at his window watching the grey North Sea crash against black rocks. He had not slept, had not even attempted to sleep. The moment his mark had gone cold, he had begun preparations, not for flight, but for something else entirely. The cottage was sparse, containing only what was necessary. Dolohov had never been a man who accumulated possessions, who sought comfort or luxury. His life had been dedicated to a single purpose: serving the Dark Lord's vision of a purified, magical Britain. Everything else was distraction, weakness, sentiment that dulled the edge necessary for their work. But now that purpose had been severed, cut away as cleanly as a curse through flesh. He turned from the window to regard the room behind him. His wand lay on the table beside a single piece of parchment, both illuminated by the grey dawn light filtering through sparse curtains. The parchment contained 7 names, written in his precise handwriting. 7 targets he had been tracking for the Dark Lord, blood traitors and Order members who had thus far evaded justice. His hand moved toward the parchment, then stopped. What was the point now? Without the Dark Lord to give the orders, without the greater vision to justify the actions, what was he? Just a killer, a murderer, a man who had tortured and executed in service to an ideology that had, it seemed, failed. The thought was almost unbearable. A soft pop announced the arrival of his contact. Not a house elf, Dolohov had never kept servants, but a younger Death Eater named Yaxley, who had served as his lieutenant during several operations. "It's true then," Yaxley said without preamble, his face pale in the dim light. "The ministry is moving. They've already arrested Bellatrix Lestrange and her husband. They're coming for the rest of us." Dolohov nodded slowly, unsurprised. Bella wouldn't have gone quietly. She cast Cruciatus at an aura, lasted for nearly 10 minutes before they subdued her. Yaxley ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of barely controlled panic. "Dolohov, what do we do? Do we run? Fight? Try to claim—" "Don't say it." Dolohov's voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. "Don't insult what we've done by claiming we were forced. We made our choices freely, Yaxley. We believed in the cause. We still believe in it, don't we?" Yaxley's silence was answer enough. "Or perhaps we don't," Dolohov continued, his voice taking on a contemplative quality. Perhaps we're wondering if we were wrong, if the Dark Lord's vision was flawed, if the deaths we caused, the pain we inflicted, was all for nothing. I don't know what I believe anymore, Yaxley admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought we were building something, thought we were making Britain stronger by removing the weak elements, the impure blood. But now, he gestured helplessly. Now it just feels like we were destroying, just breaking things without creating anything to replace them. Dolohov moved to the table, picking up his wand. The wood felt familiar in his hand, warm from his own magic, responsive to his will. How many curses had he cast with this wand? How many lives had ended because of spells channeled through this piece of wood? The auras will be here within hours, he said matter-of-factly. They'll have tracked my location through their surveillance networks. I'm too prominent, too recognizable to hide for long. Then we run. Now, before they arrive, I have contacts in Bulgaria, in Romania, places where we could disappear, build new lives. New lives as what? Dolohov turned to face the younger man. Do you honestly believe we could simply walk away from what we've done? That we could pretend to be normal wizards, live ordinary lives, forget the things we've witnessed and committed? Yaxley faltered, unable to answer. No. Dolohov set his wand back on the table with deliberate care. We can't run from what we are. The only question is whether we face it with dignity or cowardice. You're talking about surrender. Yaxley's voice carried a note of betrayal. After everything we've fought for, you're just going to give up. I'm talking about reality, Yaxley. The Dark Lord is gone. Whether defeated, destroyed, or simply withdrawn, he is not here to lead us. Without him, we're just criminals. War criminals, if the Ministry chooses to see it that way. Dolohov moved to the window again, watching the waves. I could run, could hide for months, perhaps years, but eventually I would be found. And in the meantime, what would I be? A fugitive, looking over my shoulder, unable to practice magic freely, unable to live any kind of life worth living. Better than Azkaban, Yaxley said desperately. Better than Dementors. Perhaps. Dolohov's voice was distant. Or perhaps Azkaban is what we've earned, what we deserve for our choices. The words seemed to echo in the small cottage. Yaxley stared at the older Death Eater, clearly struggling to reconcile this philosophical acceptance with the ruthless enforcer he had known. I won't tell you what to do, Dolohov continued. You're young enough, unknown enough, that you might successfully disappear, build that new life you mentioned. But know that if you do, you'll carry the weight of what we've done for the rest of your days. There's no running from memory, from conscience. And you? Yaxley asked. What will you do? Dolohov was silent for a long moment, watching the sea, watching the dawn strengthen over the water. I will wait, he said finally. Wait for the auras to arrive. Face trial. Accept whatever judgment comes. It's not nobility, Yaxley. It's simply exhaustion. I'm tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of living in a world where every action is justified by an ideology that may have been hollow from the start. Yaxley backed toward the door, his face a mixture of pity and contempt. You're giving up. The Dark Lord would be ashamed. The Dark Lord is gone. Dolohov didn't turn from the window. His shame or pride no longer matters. Only what we each choose to do with what remains of our lives. Yaxley disapparated with a sharp crack. leaving Dolohov alone with the grey morning and his thoughts. He stood at the window for a long time, watching the sea, remembering. He remembered the early days, when belief had been pure and uncomplicated, when the Dark Lord's vision had seemed not just possible, but inevitable. A magical Britain purged of weakness, where pure-blood wizards could practice their craft without the dilution of Muggle influence, where power and heritage determined worth. He remembered the first time he had cast Cruciatus, the shock of how natural it had felt, how the victim's screams had seemed almost musical in their intensity. He remembered the moment that belief had begun to crack, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, imperceptibly, like ice melting in spring. The realization that many of those they called blood traitors were more talented, more powerful than the purebloods they claimed were superior. The growing understanding that the Dark Lord's promises of a glorious future kept receding, always just beyond reach, requiring just one more sacrifice, one more atrocity. He remembered the faces of those he had killed. Not all of them. There had been too many for that. But some. A young witch, barely out of Hogwarts, who had begged for her life in a voice that reminded him of his own sister. An old wizard who had faced death with such quiet dignity that Dolohov had felt, for just a moment, ashamed. The sound of approaching apparition broke his reverie. Not Yaxley returning, but multiple arrivals. The coordinated cracks of trained auras materializing at the perimeter of his wards. Dolohov took a deep breath, feeling something like peace settle over him. He walked to the table, picked up the parchment with the 7 names, and touched his wand to it. The paper burst into flames, burning quickly to ash. Those targets would live now. Whatever happened to him, at least he would not add to the count of deaths he already carried. Antonin Dolohov. The amplified voice came from outside, professional and controlled. This is the Aura Office. You are under arrest for crimes including murder, torture, and conspiracy against the Ministry. Exit your dwelling with your hands visible and your wand on the ground. You have 30 seconds to comply. Dolohov moved to his front door, opened it slowly. The grey dawn light revealed a half-dozen auras arrayed in a semicircle around his cottage, wands raised, faces hard with professional focus and barely suppressed desire for vengeance. He recognized the leader, Gawain Robards, a man whose partner Dolohov had killed 3 years prior during a raid on an order safe house. "I'm unarmed," Dolohov called, raising his hands to show them empty. "My wand is inside on the table. I surrender myself to Ministry custody." The auras exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the lack of resistance. Robards moved forward cautiously, his wand never wavering. "Keep your hands visible. Move slowly. Any sudden movements, and we will respond with lethal force." "I understand." Dolohov stepped out of his cottage, feeling the cold November wind cut through his robes. "I only ask one thing, that I be allowed to face trial properly, not summary execution, not convenient disappearance. Proper justice, according to law." Robards' face twisted with something between respect and disgust. "You'll get your trial, Dolohov, though Merlin knows you've never given your victim such courtesy." "No," Dolohov agreed quietly as binding spells wrapped around his wrists as auras moved to search his cottage. "I haven't, which is why I don't expect mercy, only justice." They led him away from the cottage, away from the sea and the grey dawn, toward whatever future awaited in ministry custody. As they prepared to side along apparate him to London, Dolohov cast one last look at the waves crashing against the rocks. The Dark Lord was gone. The cause was lost. But Antonin Dolohov remained and would face the consequences of his choices with whatever dignity he could muster. It was, he thought, the only kind of honor left to him. In manor houses and modest homes across Britain, similar scenes were playing out. Some Death Eaters chose flight, disapparating to the continent or beyond, hoping to outrun justice. Some chose defiance, raising wands against the auras who came for them, determined to go down fighting. And some, like Dolohov, chose acceptance. The pattern would continue throughout the day as the ministry mobilized its forces, as the Aura Office worked through its lists of known Death Eaters, as justice, delayed for so long by fear and the Dark Lord's power, finally began to move. But in the grey November dawn, as Antonin Dolohov was led away in chains and Bellatrix Lestrange screamed her defiance from a ministry holding cell, the question that haunted every Death Eater was the same. What now? What existed beyond the ideology that had defined them, beyond the cause that had given their lives meaning, beyond the Dark Lord who had promised them glory and delivered only ashes? The answer would take years to unfold, would require trials and testimonies and painful reckonings with truth. But on this morning, the morning after the Dark Lord fell, the only certainty was that the world had changed irrevocably, and those who had served darkness now faced the light of accountability, whether they were ready for it or not. The sun rose over Diagon Alley at precisely 7:43 on the morning of November 2nd, painting the cobblestones gold and illuminating shop windows that still bore the scars of war. Cracked glass hastily repaired, faded anti-dark arts posters, protective wards visible as faint shimmers in the early light. For months, the alley had been subdued, its usual bustle muted by fear. Shops closed early. Families hurried through their errands with heads down and wands ready. The joy that had once characterized magical Britain's premier shopping district had been replaced by wariness and dread. This morning, everything was different. Madame Malkin stood in the doorway of her robe shop, a cup of tea cooling in her hands as she watched the transformation unfold. She had been one of the first shopkeepers to arrive, unlocking her door in the pre-dawn darkness, as she had every day for 40 years. But instead of the usual quiet morning routine, preparing the day's alterations, arranging new stock, perhaps enjoying a few moments of peace before customers arrived, she had found herself swept up in something extraordinary. The alley was filling with people, not the usual morning crowd of shoppers and ministry workers passing through on their way to the flu network. These were people who had come specifically to be here, to be together, to share in something that still seemed too impossible to fully believe. They arrived in ones and twos at first, then in small groups, then in crowds that swelled and merged until the entire alley was packed with witches and wizards of every age and description. And they were celebrating. "I still can't quite believe it," said a voice beside her. Madame Malkin turned to see Fortescue, the ice cream parlour owner, leaning against her doorframe with his own cup of tea. His usually jovial face was streaked with tears. He made no effort to hide. "My brother," he said simply. "The Death Eaters killed him in 79. I thought I'd never see justice for that. Never thought I'd see this day." Madame Malkin reached out, squeezing his arm gently. I know, Florian, I know. All across the alley, similar conversations were unfolding. Grief and joy intermingled, relief and disbelief, creating an atmosphere so charged with emotion that the very air seemed to crackle with it. Someone had strung up makeshift decorations, colored streamers that sparkled and shifted hue in the morning light. Music was beginning to play from somewhere. A wizard's wireless turned up loud, broadcasting celebratory songs that hadn't been heard in years. Near the entrance to Nocturne Alley, a group of witches had formed a circle and were dancing, their robes swirling as they spun and laughed with abandon. By flourish and blots, families gathered to read the special edition of the Daily Prophet that had appeared an hour earlier, its headline visible even from a distance. The boy who lived, you know who, defeated. It's like the end of Grindelwald all over again, Fortescue said, watching the crowds. I was just a boy then, but I remember the celebrations. Though those were tinged with sadness for all the losses in the war, this feels, he paused, searching for words, lighter somehow, like we can finally breathe again. Madame Malkin nodded, though her own feelings were more complicated. She had seen both wizarding wars now, had watched Britain descend into darkness twice in her lifetime. The celebration was warranted. Merlin knew it was warranted, but she couldn't quite shake the feeling that beneath the joy lay layers of trauma that would take years to fully process. Madame Malkin, a young witch, broke away from the crowd, practically running toward the shop. It took Madame Malkin a moment to recognize her, Alice Spinnet, whose daughter had been one of her regular customers before the family went into hiding 2 years ago. Is it true? Is it really true? He's gone. That's what they're saying, dear. Madame Malkin set down her teacup to embrace the younger woman, feeling Alice's whole body trembling with emotion. You're safe now. You can come home. Alice pulled back, her face wet with tears. We've been hiding in a cottage in Wales, living under Fidelius, barely daring to use magic in case someone tracked it. My daughter is 9 years old, and she spent the last 2 years being afraid of her own shadow. But now she can go back to school, can have friends again, can just be a child. Where is she? Madame Malkin asked, looking around. With her father, over by Fortescue's. He's buying her ice cream for breakfast because we can. Because there's no reason to hide anymore. No reason to ration our happiness in case someone notices. Alice laughed, the sound slightly hysterical, but genuine. Ice cream for breakfast. It's absurd, but right now everything feels absurd and wonderful, and I can't stop crying. She hurried back towards her family, leaving Madame Malkin and Fortescue standing together in the doorway. Around them, the celebration continued to build. Someone had started setting off magical fireworks that exploded overhead in showers of gold and scarlet sparks. A group of elderly wizards had begun singing Odo the Hero in slightly off-key harmony. Children darted through the crowd, their laughter ringing clear and uninhibited in a way that had been absent for far too long. But not everyone was celebrating. Madame Malkin's trained eye caught sight of a witch standing alone near Ollivander's, her dark robes and careful stillness setting her apart from the jubilant crowd. The woman's face was composed, neutral, but her hands gripped her wand with white-knuckled intensity. That's Marianne Roll, Fortescue murmured, following Madame Malkin's gaze. Her husband was a Death Eater. Got himself killed in a raid on the Longbottoms house last year. I remember. Madame Malkin watched the woman, noting the defensive set of her shoulders, the way her eyes tracked the crowd with something like fear. She has children, doesn't she? 3, and no other family to speak of. Whatever role left her won't last long. The ministry will probably seize assets, claim it was gained through Death Eater activities. Fortescue's voice carried genuine sympathy despite the nature of Roll's crimes. The sins of the fathers and all that. Madame Malkin made a decision. She crossed the street, navigating through the celebrating crowds, until she stood beside Marianne Roll. The younger woman stiffened immediately, her hand tightening on her wand. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Madame Malkin said quietly. "I just wanted to say that if you need anything, for your children, my shop is open. Growing children need robes. I don't charge families who are struggling." Marianne's face worked through several emotions before settling on a kind of cautious gratitude. "Why would you help me? My husband, he did terrible things. I know what people think, what they'll say about my family." "You're not your husband." Madame Malkin kept her voice gentle but firm. "Your children aren't their father. The war is over, which means we all have to decide what kind of world we're going to build now. I'd prefer it to be one where children aren't punished for their parents' mistakes." Marianne's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." She slipped away into the crowd, and Madame Malkin returned to her doorway, where Fortescue was watching with an unreadable expression. "That was generous of you," he said finally, "or naive." Madame Malkin picked up her now cold tea. "Half the people here would say I'm being too soft, that Death Eater families don't deserve sympathy. The other half would say I'm not doing enough. That true. Reconciliation requires more than charity." "And what do you say?" Madame Malkin looked out at the alley, at the complicated tapestry of emotion on display, joy and grief, relief and uncertainty, hope and lingering fear, all woven together into something messy and human and real. "I say we're all just doing the best we can," she said, finally. "And that's going to have to be enough." In a small flat above the leaky cauldron, Emmeline Vance sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing yesterday's robes, and stared at the photograph in her hands. It showed 4 people: herself, her brother Marcus, and 2 other Order members, taken at a meeting 3 years ago. They were laughing at something outside the frame, young and brave and certain they would survive the war. Only Emmeline had. The celebration from below filtered up through the floorboards, music and laughter, and the sound of too many people packed into Tom's pub, drinking and singing and rejoicing. She had been down there herself an hour ago, had let herself be swept up in the initial euphoria when the news first broke, had drunk fire whiskey with strangers and embraced people she barely knew, and allowed herself for just a moment to feel pure joy. Then she had come upstairs and looked at this photograph, and the joy had curdled into something more complicated. A knock at her door made her look up. "It's open," she called, her voice rough. Sturgis Podmore entered, another Order member, looking as exhausted as she felt. He carried 2 cups of what smelled like strong tea, offering her one as he settled into her only chair. "Thought you might need this more than fire whiskey," he said. Emmeline accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. "How long have you been awake?" "Haven't slept. Doubt I could, even if I tried." Sturgis ran a hand over his face. "Keep expecting to wake up and find out it was all a dream. that he's still out there, still planning his next move. I know what you mean. Emmeline set the photograph face down on her nightstand, unable to look at it anymore. It doesn't feel real yet. The whole night has this strange quality, like we're all moving through something that hasn't quite solidified into truth. Below them, someone started leading the crowd in a chorus of "We'll all go down to Odo's," the bawdy drinking song that had been banned during the height of the war for fear it would draw Death Eater attention to gatherings. Now it rang out with defiant joy, voices raised in harmonies that were more enthusiastic than accurate. "They're happy," Sturgis observed. "They should be happy. This is what we fought for, what we lost friends for, the right to celebrate without fear, to live without looking over our shoulders." Then why do I feel so empty? The question burst from Emmeline before she could stop it. Marcus is still gone. Dorcas is still dead. Caradoc disappeared, and we never found his body. The Preweds, the McKinnons, entire families wiped out. And yes, the Dark Lord is defeated. Yes, we won. But what did we actually win, Sturgis? What's left when you subtract all the losses from the victory? Sturgis was quiet for a long moment. "Everything," he said finally. "Everything is what's left. The future that all those people died for, the right for children to grow up without fear, for Muggle-borns to walk safely in Diagon Alley, for families to live without Death Eaters terrorizing them in the night. It doesn't erase the losses, Emmeline. Nothing could. But it gives them meaning." Meaning. Emmeline tasted the word, finding it insufficient, but perhaps the best they had. I suppose that's something. They sat in companionable silence, drinking their tea while the celebration continued below. Through her small window, Emmeline could see more people arriving in Diagon Alley, more joy spreading through the magical community, like ripples across water. "Dumbledore called a meeting," Sturgis said eventually. "This afternoon at headquarters. He wants to discuss what happens next, how the Order transitions now that the war is over." "Transitions to what?" "That's what the meeting is for, I suppose." Sturgis stood, setting his empty cup on her dresser. "We've been a resistance movement, a military organization. But maybe now we can be something else. Something that helps rebuild, that works toward healing, rather than just fighting." After he left, Emmeline picked up the photograph again. She traced her brother's face with one finger, remembering his laugh, his terrible jokes, the way he'd always known how to make her feel better when missions went wrong. "We won, Marcus," she whispered to the image. "I thought you'd want to know. We actually won." The photograph. Marcus just kept laughing, frozen in a moment of happiness that had existed 3 years ago, before Death Eaters had caught him on a routine patrol, before his body had been found 3 days later, bearing signs of torture that still haunted Emmeline's nightmares. She set the photograph carefully on her nightstand, facing outward this time. Then she stood, straightened her robes, and prepared to go back downstairs. The celebration wouldn't wait for her grief to resolve itself. And perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps the point was to carry both, the sorrow and the joy, the losses and the victory, the past and the future, all at once. By mid-morning, Diagon Alley had transformed into something unprecedented in its long history. Shop owners had given up any pretense of conducting normal business, instead joining the celebration or offering free treats to the crowds. Fortescue was handing out ice cream to anyone who asked. The Weasley twins' uncles had set up an impromptu fireworks display that filled the sky with magical creatures made of light. Even Gringotts, usually stern and businesslike, had goblins standing at the entrance, acknowledging the celebrating crowds with what might have been the goblin equivalent of good wishes. But at the edges of the celebration, tensions simmered. A fight broke out near the entrance to Nocturne Alley when someone accused a wizard of having Death Eater sympathies. Auras had to intervene, separating the combatants and reminding the crowd that vigilante justice would not be tolerated. Several people were turned away from the alley entirely, deemed too drunk or too volatile to safely join the celebration. And throughout it all, the question that no one quite wanted to voice aloud. What came next? The Dark Lord was gone, yes. But the society that had produced him, the prejudices and inequalities that had made his rise possible, the trauma and division that had torn Britain apart for over a decade, none of that had disappeared with his defeat. The celebration was real and warranted, but beneath it lay the awareness that this was only the end of one chapter, not the end of the story. As the sun climbed higher, warming the November air, Madame Malkin finally closed her shop door and allowed herself to simply stand in the crowd, to be part of the moment rather than observing it. Around her, witches and wizards danced and sang, wept and embraced, told stories of survival and loss, made toast to the fallen and promises for the future. It was messy and complicated and imperfect, like any human gathering, like any moment of transition between what was and what would be. But it was also genuine, a collective release of fear and grief and hope that had been building for years. The first light of peace, Madame Malkin thought, watching the sun illuminate the alley in shades of gold. Not the clear light of morning that revealed everything with perfect clarity, but the softer light of dawn that promised day was coming, even if shadows still lingered. It was enough. For now, it was enough. And in that moment, standing in a crowd of strangers who were also neighbors and fellow survivors, Madame Malkin allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they would find their way through whatever came next. Together. The house elf quarters beneath Malfoy Manor had never been designed for comfort. Carved from stone deep in the earth, lit by enchanted flames that gave off light but little warmth, the space reflected the Malfoy family's view of those who served them. Necessary but beneath notice, functional but unworthy of luxury. For generations, house elves had slept on thin pallets in these chambers, had tended their wounds in silence, had whispered their fears in voices too quiet to disturb the masters above. On the morning of November 3rd, Dobby stood alone in the common space, staring at the ceiling as if he could see through stone and wood and luxury to the sky beyond. He had not slept for 2 nights now. Every time he closed his enormous eyes, he felt the change in the air, the lifting of the oppressive weight that had pressed down on all of magical Britain for so long. The Dark Lord was gone. The words still felt dangerous to think, even now, still felt like something that could bring punishment, could summon Master Malfoy's wrath. But as the hours passed and the truth solidified, as news filtered down even to the house elf quarters, through overheard conversations and whispered gossip from the portrait network, the impossible became undeniable. The darkness had lifted. "Dobby is being foolish," came Thistle's reedy voice from the doorway. The old elf moved slowly into the room, her ancient bones creaking with each step. Dobby should be resting. There is being much work to do when Master wakes. Master is already awake, Dobby said quietly. Dobby heard him pacing in his study at dawn. Master is not sleeping either. Thistle settled onto one of the pallets with a soft grunt. No, Master is afraid. Dobby can smell it in the air of the manor, fear and uncertainty. The Dark Lord's protection is gone. Now Master must be facing consequences alone. The word hung between them. Consequences. For years, the house elves of Malfoy Manor had witnessed things they were magically compelled never to speak of, had cleaned blood from Master's robes after raids, had tended to injured Death Eaters who appeared through the flue at odd hours, had prepared the drawing room for meetings where dark plans were made and darker magic discussed. They had been silent witnesses to everything, and now the reckoning was coming. What is happening to Master? Dobby asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Is Master going to Azkaban? Dobby must not speak of such things. But Thistle's rebuke lacked conviction. She stared at her gnarled hands, twisted by decades of service. Though Thistle has been hearing things. Mistress Narcissa has been sending letters, many letters, to solicitors, to ministry contacts, to family. She is being protective of Master, building defenses. And Master's mark? Dobby touched his own thin forearm, the place where, had he been a wizard, a dark mark might have burned. It is still faded? Still faded. Master looks at it when he thinks no one is watching. Master's face becomes... Thistle struggled for words. Lost, as if Master does not know who he is without the Dark Lord to serve. A soft pop announced the arrival of another elf. Pipsy from the Parkinson estate, one of the elves who sometimes visited during inter-household gatherings. But Pipsy's appearance was shocking. One of her enormous ears was torn, barely healed, and her thin frame bore the marks of recent punishment. Pipsy! Dobby rushed forward, helping the swaying elf to sit. What has happened? Who has hurt you? Master Parkinson is raging, Pipsy wheezed, her voice weak. Master is saying the Dark Lord will return, that this is being a test. Master is punishing anyone who suggests otherwise. Pipsy only asked if Pipsy should be preparing the house for ministry inspection, and Master... She touched her torn ear with trembling fingers. Master was very angry. Thistle moved with surprising speed for one so ancient, examining Pipsy's injuries with gentle touches. Pipsy must not return there. Master Parkinson is being dangerous when cornered. If Master truly believes the Dark Lord is coming back, Master will do terrible things to prove loyalty. But Pipsy must return. The younger elf's eyes widened with panic. Pipsy is bound to the Parkinson family. Pipsy must serve. It is being Pipsy's purpose. Even if serving means dying. Dobby's voice came out stronger than he intended, surprising even himself. Even if Master Parkinson is hurting Pipsy for no reason except Master's own fear. Pipsy stared at him, clearly struggling with concepts that went against everything she had been taught, everything the magical binding that tied house elves to their families demanded. What else is there being for house elves? We is property. We is bound. Without serving. What is we? The question echoed in the stone chamber, unanswerable and terrible. Dobby felt it press against his chest, felt the magical compulsion that tied him to the Malfoy family pulse in his very bones. He was bound. They were all bound. And yet, the Dark Lord was being the most powerful wizard alive, Dobby said slowly, working through thoughts that felt revolutionary and dangerous. Everyone was saying, He could not be defeated, but he was defeated by a baby. If something impossible like that can be happening, then maybe other impossible things can happen too. Dobby speaks dangerous words, Thistle warned, but her eyes held something that might have been hope, carefully hidden beneath layers of caution. House elves cannot be changing their circumstances. It is not being in our power. Maybe not now. Dobby helped Pipsy to lie down on one of the pallets, pulling a thin blanket over her shivering form. But the world is changing. Dobby can feel it. The air itself feels different, lighter, cleaner. Perhaps house elves can be changing too someday. A sound from above, footsteps in the manor proper, moving with purpose toward the stairs that led to the house elf quarters. All three elves froze, their survival instincts screaming warnings. Masters never came to the house elf quarters, never descended to the servants' domain. If Master Malfoy was coming down here, something was very wrong. But it wasn't Lucius Malfoy who appeared at the bottom of the stairs. It was Narcissa, her blonde hair caught back in a simple ribbon, her face showing the strain of sleepless nights, but maintaining its composed beauty. The elves immediately prostrated themselves, foreheads pressed to the cold stone floor. "Mistress," Thistle breathed, "how can we be serving?" "Rise, please." Narcissa's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "I've come to speak with you about changes." Slowly the elves got to their feet, though they kept their eyes downcast, their bodies ready to grovel again at the slightest sign of displeasure. Narcissa looked at each of them in turn, her gaze lingering on Pipsy's injuries. "The house elf from Parkinson Manor," she said, recognition in her voice. "Your master sent you here." "No, mistress," Pipsy whispered. "Pipsy came for healing. Pipsy will be returning immediately if mistress commands it." "You will do no such thing." Narcissa's voice hardened. "Parkinson is a fool, lashing out because he's frightened. You'll stay here until your injuries are healed, and then—" She paused, seemed to make a decision. "And then I will speak with certain contacts about finding you a new household, one that won't half kill you for asking reasonable questions." The elves stared at her in shock. House elves weren't transferred between families except through formal contracts or inheritance. For a mistress to arrange such a thing, to interfere in another family's house elf management, was unprecedented. "Mistress is being kind," Thistle said cautiously, as if testing the word for traps. "I'm being practical." But something in Narcissa's face softened slightly. The Ministry is going to be scrutinizing Death Eater families very closely in the coming weeks. They'll be looking for evidence of cruelty, of dark arts, of anything they can use against us. I won't have it said that the Malfoy household mistreats its servants, or that we harbor injured elves from other families without rendering assistance. The political calculation was clear, but beneath it, the elves sensed something else. A genuine discomfort with unnecessary cruelty, a pragmatic kindness that was still kindness nonetheless. "There will be other changes as well," Narcissa continued, pacing slowly in the small space, her fine robes incongruous against the rough stone walls. "The manor will be open to Ministry inspection. They will look through every room, every artifact, every record. I'm told they may question household staff, including house elves." Dobby's heart began to race. Question them about what they had seen, what they knew. But they were bound by magic not to speak of family secrets, bound to protect their masters even from their own testimony. "I want to be clear," Narcissa said. stopping her pacing to face them directly. You will answer any questions the ministry asks truthfully. I am releasing you from the magical compulsion to keep family secrets, but only in regards to ministry interrogation. Do you understand? The words fell like stones into deep water. Thistle made a small sound of shock. Dobby felt the magical binding around his chest shift, loosen slightly in a way he had never experienced before. Mistress cannot be doing this, Thistle whispered. If we is speaking of what we is seeing, Master could be going to Azkaban. If my husband goes to Azkaban, it will be because of his own choices, not because of anything you say. Narcissa's voice was steady, but her hands clenched at her sides. The Dark Lord is gone. The war is over. What matters now is protecting our son, ensuring Draco grows up with at least one parent free to care for him. If that means being honest about the past, then so be it. She swept toward the stairs, then paused, looking back at the three elves. One more thing. From this day forward, Malfoy house elves will not be punished physically, except in cases of genuine disobedience or danger to the family. Minor mistakes, accidents, questions. These will be addressed with words, not violence. I expect this standard to be maintained throughout the household. With that, she ascended the stairs, leaving the elves staring after her in stunned silence. Did Mistress just... Dobby couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't quite process what had just happened. Mistress is being clever, Thistle said slowly, her ancient eyes thoughtful. Mistress sees which way the wind is blowing. The old ways, the Dark Lord's ways, they is ending. Mistress is adapting to survive, to protect her son. But the old elf's voice softened. Mistress is also being kind, in her way. Could have done none of this, could have let us face ministry questions bound to silence. Instead, Mistress gives us permission to speak truth. What will we tell them? Pipsy asked fearfully. What truth is we speaking? The truth of what we is seeing, Thistle said firmly. Master attending meetings with Death Eaters, Master coming home with blood on his robes, Master preparing for raids. We will speak truth because Mistress commands it, and because... She paused, something shifting in her expression. Because perhaps it is time for truth. Perhaps lies and secrets is what allowed the darkness to grow so strong. Dobby moved to the small window that looked out at ground level, showing a slice of the manor's gardens. Dawn was strengthening, painting the world in shades of pink and gold. Peacocks strutted across the lawn, their calls echoing in the morning air. Everything looked the same as it always had. Beautiful, expensive, perfectly maintained. But something fundamental had shifted. The darkness that had hung over the manor for years, that had made even the most beautiful rooms feel cold and threatening, had lifted. The air felt lighter. The very stones of the manor seemed to breathe easier. The world is changing, Dobby said quietly, watching the sunrise. Everything is changing. Yes, Thistle agreed, joining him at the window. And perhaps that is being a good thing. Perhaps change is being better than the familiar darkness we is knowing. Above them, in the manor proper, they could hear movement. Narcissa speaking with her husband, their voices too distant to make out words, but carrying the tones of serious discussion. Planning, strategizing, adapting to a world where the Dark Lord's protection no longer shielded them from consequences. What is happening to other Death Eaters? Pipsy asked from her pallet. Master Parkinson was saying some is being arrested, some is fleeing. Mistress Bellatrix Lestrange is being arrested, Thistle said. Dobby heard it from the portrait of Master's great-grandfather. She fought the Auras, tried to curse them. They is taking her to Azkaban to await trial. And Master, Dobby asked, what is happening to our Master? Master is being questioned, but not arrested. Yet. Thistle's expression was carefully neutral. Master has gold, has solicitors, has family connections. Master will claim Imperious Curse, will say he was forced. Whether Ministry believes this, she shrugged. Time will tell. They fell silent, 3 house elves bound to service, watching the sun rise over grounds that had witnessed so much darkness. Around them, Britain was waking to its 3rd day of peace, its 3rd day of trying to process the impossible reality that the Dark Lord was truly gone. In Diagon Alley, the celebrations were beginning to wind down, exhaustion and hangovers replacing the initial euphoria. In the Ministry, Auras continued their arrests and interrogations, building cases against Death Eaters who had terrorized Britain for over a decade. In homes across the country, families began the difficult work of healing from trauma, of rebuilding lives that had been on hold for years, of learning how to live without fear. And in the depths of Malfoy Manor, 3 house elves stood together and felt the change in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the first warm breeze of spring after a brutal winter. Dobby is thinking, Dobby said slowly, that perhaps Dobby would like to be free someday. Not now. Dobby is not ready, and the world is not ready. But someday, when the changing has settled, when new ways is replacing old ways. Dangerous thinking, Thistle said, but there was no rebuke in her voice, only a kind of weary acknowledgement. But perhaps also brave thinking. The Dark Lord taught wizards that pure blood made them superior, that muggles and muggle-borns was worthless. A baby proved him wrong. Perhaps house elves can be proving other things wrong too, in time. In time, Pipsy agreed softly from her palate, her torn ear already beginning to heal in the safety of Malfoy Manor's gentler regime. The sun continued its rise, warming the November earth, driving back the shadows. In the manor above, Lucius Malfoy stared at his faded dark mark and contemplated a future he had never imagined he would need to face. In the Ministry, Barty Crouch organized trials and built cases, trying to balance justice with mercy. In Godric's Hollow, the ruins of the Potter House stood as silent testimony to sacrifice and survival. In Diagon Alley, shop owners began cleaning up after days of celebration, sweeping away the physical debris, while emotional debris would take far longer to process. Everywhere, across magical Britain, the same realization was settling in. The war was over. The darkness had lifted. The air felt lighter. What came next would be complicated. Trials and testimonies, healing and rebuilding, reconciliation and remembrance. There would be setbacks and struggles, moments when the darkness seemed to creep back in, times when the path forward seemed impossibly difficult. But standing in that house elf quarter beneath Malfoy Manor, watching the sunrise through a small window, Dobby allowed himself something he had rarely experienced in his young life: hope. The Dark Lord was gone. The world was changing. And perhaps, there was space in that change for even house elves to dream of something better. The sun climbed higher, washing the world in golden light. The peacocks called, the manor breathed, and deep in the earth, 3 house elves stood together in silence, bearing witness to the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The night the dark mark faded, had passed into history, but its echoes would ripple forward for years to come, shaping the world that rose from the ashes of Voldemort's defeat. For better or worse, for light or shadow, for justice or mercy, the future was unwritten. And in that uncertainty lay both terror and tremendous possibility. The air felt lighter, and that, for now, was enough.